All right. Hi there. Welcome. Javier González is the director and co-founder of SUMMA, the Laboratory for Research and Innovation and Education for Latin America and the Caribbean, from where he advises and works collaboratively with the authorities of the Ministries of Education of 14 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, promoting research and educational policies that promote greater social justice. So without any further ado, Javier, I'll let you get started here.
Well, good morning to everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank the Campbell Collaboration Foundation for inviting me to this very important, exciting webinar series. I think, especially after pandemia, we're very much concerned about the role of evidence and the role of evidence and knowledge, and how can we improve, right, education systems by, well, basically putting that knowledge to use by policymakers in order to improve quality, in order to improve equity, and of course, inclusion in our educational systems. As we know, it's not an automatic process, and it's quite complex. So what I would like to do today is basically to offer maybe a slightly different take on how to understand the role of aliens, how to understand basically how reforms happen, and as we usually hear, and what has become quite a buzzword is the word of scaling. We are all, of course, very much concerned of how to scale, how to impact social justice, how to impact reforms. And it seems to me that we usually are limited to a kind of a linear model in which we believe that the more evidence we have, the better policies we'll have. And what I would like to maybe share some reflections about is on the fact that institutions and reforms happen not in a linear manner, but actually they're driven by, of course, by knowledge, but also by asymmetries of power, by cultural changes, and by other factors that I will discuss throughout the presentation. I would like to just highlight the fact that I'm not sharing these ideas or reflections only from academia, where I've been working for more than a decade, but also having worked for more than 20 years in actual educational reform at the government level. So it's a mix of reflection between theory and also practice on how I believe, and from SUMMA we believe, institutional change and general reforms happen. So what I would like to do is to basically share with you some thoughts on how to better understand this, what I called policy or institutional change. So I think the first and fair question would be, well, why don't we start just talking about aliens and how to scale aliens, and just basically start from there, and looking at impact and modes of impact, as most of our discussions today seem to be framed. And why should we focus on institutional change, which is kind of a broader perspective, I would believe, which comes very much from political economy, from institutional sociology, from institutional economics as well, of course, and political science. And I think some of the questions we would have to do to ourselves is basically have to do a lot with the fact that it seems that we all want this better education around the world. Different leaders express their willingness to improve education. It seems to be quite a common ground. And the question, therefore, would be, why don't we move in that direction? Why do we see that educational systems are so different between countries? If hypothetically, maybe at by 2023, we should have an idea based on Arians of what should be the optimal model, let's say, or at least a few optimal models. But when we see across the world and international development, we see that we have as many models as countries, right? So if we all agree, and of course they don't deliver the outcomes that we want, so the question is, why is it so difficult to promote and carry out the reforms we probably believe should be carried out? Why is that change so difficult? And some of the questions we could say or hypotheses that we could have is that once is basically we don't have the knowledge, basically we're ignorant regarding the optimal solutions. Another one could be that basically politicians don't care or are not willing really to improve education, to promote changes. These seem quite simple questions, but I think they're quite at the heart of the problem in thinking, well, if we actually have or believe to have in academia the solutions, why are we not able to really promote these solutions in society? And that's a very kind of fundamental question for us, and should be for us and for all of the institutions such as SUMMA or Campbell Foundation, Campbell Collaboration Foundation. What is the role of Arians in all of this? And usually what we hear is that the solution seems to be that we don't know maybe, and we need to just, or politicians don't know how to use Arians, and therefore it's just an issue of putting Arians out there in order to be used. So what I would like to first of all say that the problem is that so taking this into education, I would like to say, of course, just to say that, well, to question the fact if we actually have or not a common vision. So let me address very quickly the importance and the complexity of the task at hand, which is basically changing education, reforming education systems. And of course, we in general, by 2023, will agree that education is a human right. That, of course, is important for the expansion of our freedoms. Amartya would say that development is freedom. So we want to expand our beings and doings, so our capacity to determine our own life. And we believe that it's a place where education is a place, and schools are a place where we can recognize, value, and build upon diversity, as we have defined inclusion by SUMMA and UNESCO in our last GEM report 2020 for Latin America. But of course, in order to achieve these goals, and let's say up to there, we're quite, we have an agreement. It seems that we need an institutional base, because basically one of the ways, of course, of understanding if human right to education is being met is by looking at the 4 A's, right? Availability, access, adaptation, and quality, basically, or acceptability. And for these, of course, issues to be met, we have to look at institutions. And here I want to use the simplest way of looking at institutions, which is not organizations, but it's basically the rules of the game. As Douglas North, Nobel Prize, economics Nobel Prize, would define it as institutions have rules of the game. Basically, they define as any rule of the game, who can play in it, what are the rules to progress, for example, in this game, who wins, and what do you get for winning the game. If you think of education as an institution in that sense, we define who can actually teach or who can actually be educated. What are the rules for that? Do you have to pay? Do you have to go through admission? What do you have to do to progress along the system? What do you get after you graduate? And what does the labor market provide for those who actually get different types of degrees, etc.? And therefore, we have different institutions, different rules of the game, which are formal, these laws and regulations, and informal, which are, of course, social norms that are not written, but of course are quite real and define actually also who gets what, especially in stratified and unequal societies. So One first issue, of course, is the shape and structure of these institutions, the shape and ways in which we set these rules of the game will define, of course, who gets what in education. But also, of course, the characteristics of the actors, the capabilities, the values, and the preferences of these actors will also play an important role, because basically they will interact with these rules in order to basically, well, define the final outcomes. So I'm going a little bit, again, not directly to the issue of audience. So let me just bear with me a couple of minutes and you will see where we probably arrive. But the point is, therefore, that if we have these institutions, if we believe John Rawls, one of the most important political philosophers of our era, of the 20th century, we will believe that the most important value of how we should design institutions have to do with fairness, basically, and social justice. But as we see and we analyze institutions around the world, education institutions around the world, or education systems around the world, we'll see that we're quite far away from that. And why is that? Well, it is because it's due to the fact that education, of course, has a lot of tensions within that are part of the heart of education as well. One of it is the fact that, of course, education is an arena in society in which entails continuity and change at the same time. Look at curriculum. In the curriculum, you have to negotiate as a society, basically this tension between what we want to preserve from the past, what we want to, of course, keep and consolidate from the present, and of course, what other values we want to change for future societies. There are tensions between autonomy and socialization. On the one hand, of course, we want people that go through the educational system to be autonomous, to define their own goals, to be able to criticize and have a critical perspective on economic, social, and political life and political institutions. But on the other hand, we want also for them to be able to share common values and build the new future in a collaborative way. So there's also a tension there, as in the goals of the education itself. Is it an individual issue, or is it a collective goal? And we must remember that education has moved from the private sphere, being let's say a good only for the elite, into the social sphere during the 19th century and 20th century, and then back in some cases to the private sphere due to the human capital movement and privatization movements that have happened around the world. So there is, again, some tensions on how do we design these institutions. And that's why I'm talking about this, because, again, it's not about just having an RCT and scaling something. It has to do with what kind of institutions do we want? And that's really the problem. There's also a normative issue, not only a positive issue, but also a normative issue of what kind of institutions we want to promote in society. And within that normative goal, then therefore, what are the best means to achieve them? And that's why it's so difficult to just go directly to the fact of, well, how do we scale? Because that's a very quick shortcut to the problem, really, and inadequate, actually, one. Another issue has to do with, well, should we be able to take education to the social, to the justice system or not? Is it a legal norm or social goal? I don't want to stop too much in each one of these, but just to provide a quick snapshot on the types of things that we're actually discussing in education. The issue of the right to education versus the freedom of education and choice. That's a huge issue on constitutional rights. I had the chance of just recently writing a book on constitutional changes. And around the world, these are a very important tension between the right to education, basically, which is provided and beheld by students, versus the freedom of education, which is usually understood as a right for parents to decide what kind of education they want for their children, and therefore generally ending up in privatization movements, segmentations, and fragmentation of the education system. And just to finalize, the role of the state and the market. There's a huge, of course, wave of privatization around the world that has, and as econometric work has proven, very little evidence on how, on the capacity of markets to improve quality. But there's a lot of evidence that despite not improving quality, it has a strong impact on inequality. So therefore, privatization creates more segmentation, more fragmentation of the system, social stratification, basically. And also what it does is that it provides some way for the middle class to opt out of the public system, and therefore it creates a lot of difficulties in terms of the capacity of the state to improve basically public education because of the lack of support from the constituency to increase taxes for that improvement. So I just want to say, again, doing a small recap, that I want to offer a lens by which we should be looking at this issue of the role of aliens, the role of how can we improve or impact systems through aliens, which is looking at these rules of the game and the tensions that we have between actors to try to shape and mold these institutions according to their own beliefs. So very quickly, why do we observe these different institutions around the world? And what is the consequence for the right of education? So let me go really quickly into very basic questions for those who are not acquainted with this new language or this new lens of looking at education systems. And I promise I will go into why this lens offers a new way of looking at the importance of aliens. So let me just go very quickly on what are institutions, why they matter, and most importantly, how institutions change, happens. So the first thing, as I was saying, is we're looking at formal and informal institutions. So we should look at both laws and constitutions, but also we should be looking at the different customs and social norms that exist in the system that actually allow systems to more than allow, they usually restrict the way actors can actually play this game. Now, these institutions determine both economic performance and the distribution of resources and power. Let's look at gender, let's say discrimination. Of course, if there's gender discrimination, both economic performance will be affected, but also, of course, the distribution of power between households, between and within society. So, of course, these institutions, these rules of the game, again, what it defines first are the rights. So the distribution of collective benefits, who gets what. So it defines, is education really free? Is it really for all? It will also define our incentives to collaborate or to compete. And therefore, it will define how we interact, for example, within the educational system. Are students collaborating within the class? Or are students actually competing among themselves to get a better ranking, for example? Or better test score for somehow, for an admission test that we have settled. All of these things depend on the rules of the game that we put. Again, seems quite obvious, but I want to offer the possibility of really reflecting on this. And of course, the individual's preferences and identities are quite key. What I mean is institutions will determine, of course, in what is called the economics of identity, for example, in which we can see the fact that these rules will change people's preferences and values through time. So they're, of course, very important. Now, the key question here, and I want to go directly into this, is the fact that we want to question, well, okay, I understand that education systems are rules then. Let's hope we accept at least the possibility as a lens. And therefore the question becomes, well, how do they change? Why is the Chilean system the way it is? And why is the Finnish system the way it looks like? And why is the UK system the way it is characterized? How does it change? How can we change the system? Or why hasn't it changed? Is if everyone seems to be quite in the same, I mean, everyone seems to agree that these changes should happen. And if we take most of the literature in institutional economics and political economy, sociology and political philosophy, there's a possibility to kind of put all that together in maybe probably three main accounts of how institutions change. One is the functionalist or utilitarian perspective. The second has to do with power distributional account. And the third one, cultural sociological approach. I'm going to go very quickly in each one of these. The first one has to do with the functionalist approach. And why is it so important, especially for this webinar? Because probably most of the people that are looking at this webinar will probably have an approach or an underlying hypothesis, implicit hypothesis, that basically we assess institutions in terms of the function that they perform. So we will assess education systems according to, of course, if they deliver the goals that we want them to deliver. And therefore, we will judge a solution according to the capacity of solving collective problems, right? As we will see, it's one of the perspectives to look at of institutional change, but it's not the only one. And this is very important because if we take all of the three, we can probably understand better how institutions change, and therefore the role of aliens again, as I will conclude at the end of the presentation. So what is this view of the functionalist approach? Basically, has to do more with efficiency and efficacy. It tends to be more, of course, attached to a rational utility maximizing individuals, if you want. It's more neoclassical if you want, in terms of school of thoughts. And it usually is seen as in terms of incremental changes. Basically, what we seem to see under this approach are solutions that are marginal in their capacity to improve the current situation of a system. Okay? How does that happen? Therefore, within this approach, there are many different, but I would highlight two approaches from different schools within this approach. One has to do with basically a Darwinian approach, if you want, which basically you have different solutions, different institutions, and therefore the one that is the best solution will survive and will be scaled up, will be copied by other countries. So if we see that there's a funding system that is better than the other, for example, to provide better resources to make schools more equitable, then maybe that will survive in relation to others, and it will be copied and scaled horizontally or vertically across the world. The other fact, so it's not intentional, if you want, in the scaling up. It happens as a consequence of the strength of the solution. And the other one, of course, is the intended design, which we usually are quite acquainted with, which is the fact that we believe under this approach that decisions in institutional change happens because there's someone or an institution or an organization, in this case, that will define what is best and what actually works. Now, if institutions change through this mechanism, of course, the questions that comes to mind is, well, why do inefficient institutions persist? if we all know what is the best solution, and solutions depend on someone making that decision, the question, of course, is why do they persist? Because we are around the world, in the global south, but also in the global north, we can see many, many inefficient, unequal institutions in education. Of course, there's issue regarding the cost of change. There are issues regarding bounded rationality. For those who have worked in ministries of education, for example, as I have for many years, you will know that there's totally incomplete information and lack of time to make decisions. Political times are very quick, and sometimes research takes a lot of time, and therefore you have to make decisions on a very short time span. And that's something that, of course, has to do with bounded rationality. And also, of course, in many of the, especially in the global south, as we will see very quickly in the next slides, there's also the lack of consolidated ecosystems of knowledge and innovation to inform policymaking. Okay, so that's one way of looking at the problem, the functionist approach. There's another approach, which I think, and again, on my personal account, I would say that has to do, is much more realistic on how actually education reforms happen. That has to do much more with power struggle. Power struggle, not necessarily in a Marxist perspective in terms of social class, but in a very pluralistic, democratic society. It is legitimate for different groups to have, of course, different goals, and therefore to struggle in the democratic arena, in the Congress, for example, of course, to promote their own agendas. And therefore, that struggle will define the shape of that institution. So we're getting away from this more, let's say, simplistic manner of looking evidence and the process of institutional change as something that it's only evidence being provided to a policymaker, that policymaker reading the paper or the systematic review or the platform and making an optimal decision regarding what is the institutional change that has to be carried out or the scaling of a program. In this case, and again, if you are acquainted with politics or read the newspaper, basically you will see that different political parties, of course, are continuously, and not only political parties, unions, etc., are continuously in a democratic setting, are continuously struggling to promote their own agenda. And therefore, institutional change will reflect the power asymmetries in society. As Knight, another author, will put it, and I like this definition, he says, institution development is a contest among actors to establish rules which structure outcomes to those equilibria most favorable for them. So basically, the shape, the final outcome of a law, of a bill, of a reform, of a program, is not so much about what actually works. It's much more of who gets what, and therefore it is that's the combination of negotiations during, for example, in Congress, that will basically mold what kind of reform you will see in the typical language to be that will, I mean, this asymmetry of power will define what gets scaled up, if you want, and the way it is. So, of course, the institutional change comes as a result of the power balance between actors, and or if there's one most hegemonic actor, the preferences of the most important actor. Of course, there are many examples in education regarding segregation, civil rights movements, etc., that can show you that actually these changes have not come as a result of RCTs, but actually a result of struggle for different, to promote different normative perspectives in education. Now, the problem with this, of course, this perspective or the fact that institutions come as a result of power struggle have to do with the fact that actually you're not able to, the result which we are able to, and the results or outcome of that struggle may create solutions that are suboptimal, of course, and that creates what is called structural failure. Basically, the fact that we, in an analytical perspective, we could say we reach a suboptimal solution. But there's another concern that we should take into account that have to do with the fact that these reforms move very slowly, and they move basically, or may be blocked by the opposition through transitional costs. And here I think it's a very important concept. Transitional costs basically have to do with what are the costs that the opponents can impose on the proponents of a given reform. So basically, what we see in this case is the fact that with these reforms that are being that are trying to be promoted, basically can be blocked or can be basically slowed down because of this capacity of the opponents to impose these costs. Okay. Now, what is the result of this, or the implication of this? This has a very important implication regarding the agenda of, for example, good governance of the World Bank, regarding, for example, the issue of what are the right institutions. What this says is that context, and context is very important. Basically, politics matters. We are not able to really define a ranking of institutions, of saying this is the best solution in this context, in an absolute manner, because it depends on the context. What do I mean by this? You might have a very optimal solution from a technical perspective, but when you take into account the transitional costs to implement that reform, maybe that reform, which is technically optimal, becomes actually a suboptimal solution, because it will create so many costs that actually it will be, well, it will create a lot of distress in the system. It will create a lot of costs, transforming it into a very kind of suboptimal solution. So the technical solution basically has to be weighed also, and should take into account the political settlement of the country in which we are implementing it. So to go very quickly with the last and final cultural approach, has to do with cultural sociological approach, and basically has to do very quickly in saying there are basically worldviews, cultural scripts in which society will define what is legitimate or not, and therefore societies will change as this cultural scripts change through time. Now, of course, the criticism of this perspective is that it would probably provide more arguments to defend why, or to understand why institutions actually don't change or persist in time, why unequal or inefficient institutions are maintained despite being ineffective, than really providing an answer of why they change. Now, that said, then the question is, okay, why don't politicians or policymakers improve or change these institutions to the better? And here's the role of evidence, finally, after all these reflections I have offered, is the fact that, of course, one is, of course, that policymakers have a lack of knowledge regarding what are the right models in the world, basically, to improve education, quality, etc. And that's why, in this case, the relevance of evidence have to do with creating relevant ecosystems of knowledge, of innovation, etc. Another issue has to do with the fact that policymakers face a lot of high cost of institutional change, what I was saying, the transitional costs. And therefore, aliens should also play a role in balancing asymmetries of power among and between actors. Sometimes, for example, it could provide, let's say, aliens to unions that sometimes in some countries are not very professionalized. And therefore, aliens could provide, for example, aliens on why repetition or why non-lecturing time why repetition is a bad policy, or why non-lecturing time is a good policy, for example, for teachers to plan, provide formative feedback, and therefore improve quality of education, despite its high cost as a policy. Also, of course, policymakers have a quite shorter time horizon in terms of policy making, and therefore the relevance of collaboration and relevance of anchoring these institutional changes through partnerships with different aliens, brokerage agencies, etc., is very important. And finally, of course, the importance of cultural change, and therefore the importance of innovation, of the capacity of ecosystems to provide systematically new perspectives and paradigms in society. So what do we see in general in terms of the role of aliens? And now I'm going to go directly, having said that, but having provided this quite long introduction, but I hope it's useful to think of new ways of thinking about social change, the role of aliens. We can look, and there's an excellent paper from Howard White, which of course has also been at the Campbell Collaboration Foundation, which provides an overview on what have been what he calls the 4 waves of aliens revolution, starting with a new public management movement in the 90s, the rise of RCTs in the 2000s, the rise and increase of production of systematic reviews in the last 10 years. And then finally, also in the last 10 years, the institutionalization of the use of aliens through brokering agencies, such as SUMMA and such as others, such as EF, What Works, Clearinghouse, etc. Now, I will make a critique to this perspective, although it's of course very useful, thinking of how aliens has increasingly been playing a role in policymaking. But again, I would say that my criticism, having said what I have just presented before, is that the implicit assumption is that more aliens will provide better solutions for policymakers, and policymakers will take that solutions and transform them into policies. Now that we have looked into the 3 approaches, functionalist approach, right, the power struggle approach and cultural approach, we can now understand, of course, that this is not enough, and that we need to understand in a much better way how these ecosystems work. So that's a first conclusion that I want to provide. The second conclusion, and now staying within the approach, if you want, in terms of the importance, of course, of knowledge and ecosystems of knowledge, innovation, exchange, is to look at this global south. And here I would like to just highlight a couple of points regarding the weakness of these ecosystems in the global south. First of all, of course, we know that the generation of knowledge is quite difficult because knowledge is a public good. As in economics, we define it non-rival, and it's very difficult to exclude people from the use of this public good. And therefore, no private agent really will be able, maybe with the exception of philanthropists, will be willing to finance this knowledge, which is a public good, for which, of course, we have a lot of social returns, but very little private returns, because of course patents and other copyrights are very limited in their capacity to protect this new knowledge. Therefore, you need public financing to generate new knowledge. And of course, that is exactly what is very limited in the Global South. So that's the first limitation of why in the Global South we have very weak ecosystems of knowledge, innovation, and exchange. The second reason is that knowledge is, or the second problem, if you want, in the Global South, is that knowledge is not very relevant to the problems that we have in the Global South. And this is quite interesting, because even in the Global North, and if you see the last report from OECD, the Who Cares About Aliens in Education, which is a very good report, one of the things it shows that even in the Global North, the relevance of aliens is quite limited. So if we take that conclusion and now we move into the Global South, the situation is even worse. Why is that? Especially because the research agenda, theories, data, methodologies, etc., the main questions that are being answered and researched are basically defined by the Global North in universities and research centers established in the Global North. And they are carried out also by, of course, researchers that are not only in the Global North, but are from the Global North. So basically, they lack context, basically, of this research and of the solutions and difficulties in the Global South. Here, just to this from Nature, and just to show basically the proportion of research that is done in the Global North and Global South. From all articles, 73% come from the Global North, only 16% from the Global South, and 11% are hybrid or collaborative. So as you can see, basically, we can put some numbers into this to show the dramatic situation in terms of the generation of knowledge in the Global South. Also, there's a lot of very low intensity of face-to-face exchange between South-South and South-North researchers. And this is quite important because, as we know, knowledge can be made explicit by writing papers or creating patents, etc., to define the explicit knowledge. But what is very important in innovation is the tacit knowledge. That is knowledge that cannot be put in writing, and therefore can only be learned by human contact, basically. It is that knowledge that you learn by doing with another person, with a mentor, through internships, etc. And that is also very low. A fourth problem for the Global South has to do with the issue of how scientific knowledge is disseminated, and basically the fact that most of knowledge is disseminated and highly concentrated in the Global North, mainly in English, by very large outlets such as Springer, etc. Another issue which is very, very important has to do with, in this more of a, let's say, a symbolic issue, as Foucault will call the gatekeepers of knowledge, those who define what is true, what is not, what is legitimate or not, or what is worthy of status and prestige in academia. And most of the mechanisms that will define that validity of knowledge and the recognition and prestige of that knowledge are defined by the Global North, by different Global North institutions. Don't have too much time to go into it. Also, of course, there's a very low investment in R&D in the Global South. But most importantly, I would say that there's a very weak governance of R&D ecosystems. By this, I mean the way we make decisions and the way we prioritize our resources towards the most important problems in society. Therefore, we actually, in many of our countries, there are R&D resources being invested, but most of them are driven by the interest of researchers that they may or may not be basically connected with the most important problems in society. Therefore, we need a research agenda and a research and a development agenda and innovation agenda that actually channels those efforts towards the most important challenges of society. And then finally, of course, is the issue that in many countries, there are very weak local universities. And again, their links to the state's priority or to public priorities are quite weak, especially as a result of privatization movements that also, in some cases, create a lot of for-profit institutions that have no research component as part of their institutional development strategy. Now, because of time, I don't have time to go into this, but I'm just going to finish by showing what is happening in the global south, and especially regarding what Howard White would call the fourth wave of this aliens revolution, which is the emergence of brokering institutions. And therefore, I would like to finish very quickly by just sharing what we're doing in SUMMA, what is SUMMA, and what we're doing at the regional level. So first of all, SUMMA is a research institution and innovation institution that was created, and this links to my previous point, to strengthen the ecosystem of research, innovation, exchange in Latin America and the Caribbean. So with the diagnosis that I just showed before, many of the countries came together in 2015 and decided that there was a need for the region to create an institution capable of producing, but also synthesizing and disseminating evidence for better policies in education. Again, this does not mean that you should understand also the political process by which these reforms happen. And that's why it's so important, the first part of the theory that I showed, which has to do with how we understand the process, not as a linear process, but as a process which will feed not only, let's say, policymakers that are designing these institutional changes, but also the Congress and other debates in democratic settings. So by 2016, the Inter-American Development Bank decided to fund this initiative and create SUMMA with the support of different ministries of education. Today, we work with 21 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. We work very closely with governments, advising them in structural reforms, in program development, in program assessment. We also work very closely, because of this, with academia, NGOs, teacher unions, and also on the ground, testing and working with schools and teachers. So what do we do in SUMMA? We have a quite important commitment on strengthening the right to education with a focus on social justice. We do this at 3 levels. One at the structural level, that is constitutional level, and institutional change in terms of change of laws, of different bills, etc. Second, we work at the program level, and then even at the school level and classroom level at the pedagogical practice level. We basically do 4 things that will go very, very quickly on this. We do research, we produce new areas and knowledge on those areas where we see that there are gaps in the region. Second, we map and synthesize what is available in the world and in the region in terms of research, in terms of innovative programs. With that research and that mapping, we do innovations. So we do our own innovations. We design, implement, and evaluate these innovations, of course, we don't do the three of them. In most of the cases, when we assess, we tend to assess other institutions' projects. Of course, we don't tend to evaluate our own work. And then the most important things that what we do is we advise governments into what kind of policies are worthy of scaling, or what reforms should be promoted based on evidence and based also in democratic values and the right to education. So very quickly, just to put a couple of examples of what we're doing and areas in which we're working. So we're looking for system transformation. So it's beyond just scaling in the sense of there's an implicit assumption that the state is a provider of programs. And therefore, when we say scaling, is scaling programs. So we move a little bit away from that. Although we include that, we believe much more into system transformation, as we call it, for education justice. And we work, among other, basically in inclusion. We work in TPD, teacher professional development and pedagogical support, educational funding and regulations, and better understanding how areas and institutional change, how institutional change happens in the role of areas. Okay, so very quickly, just to show some of the things we've done. In the case of research, we developed the first GEM report, the Global Education Monitoring Report, ever done for Latin America. As you know, the GEM report is a global report. In 2020, for the first time, UNESCO decided to create a new one. So it was open to create a regional report. That was the SUMMA UNESCO report on inclusion. It was based on more than 29 studies in 19 countries in the most marginalized populations in the region. So migrants, ethnic minorities, students with special needs, LGBTI, imprisoned youth, etc. We've also done very large surveys in the region. To the best of our knowledge, it's the largest ever done survey in education in Latin America. We surveyed 200,000 teachers in 20 countries during COVID to understand what was really happening on the ground with teachers in regards to the access of students, in regards to the practices and pedagogical practices that were happening in the classroom, etc. We've done different studies more in terms of system thinking perspective with Oxford, with the RISE initiative, etc. Regarding mapping and synthesis, we work with EDF, and we are part of a network in which what we do is we take the very valuable and very important platform that has been built by the EF, the Education Endowment Foundation, which provides meta-analysis and the synthesis of evidence on what is the impact of different pedagogical practices. And we, as SUMMA, what we do is that we include a layer of evidence regarding what actually happens in the region, because until 2018, EF did not include, for example, those research that are in Spanish and great literature that can allow you to contextualize these findings in the region. We not only provide what works, but in a contextualized manner, but we also want to understand what is working for the future in terms of innovations. But we're very critical of innovation in the sense that it has become a buzzword, very empty of its own meaning, in the sense that most of innovations sometimes are not really it does not have impact. They do not have impact or do not have a clear theory of change, are not replicable, and are not scalable, etc. And just to provide some numbers, in our first exercise, we have done this already at least 3 times, increasing the number of innovations that we have analyzed. In the first exercise that we did, we reviewed 1,700 innovations around the world. And from there, only 50 innovations were replicable, scalable, worthy of any government, of any government to be scaled up or to invest. Worthy of being implemented by any government. And then finally, and I'm aware of the time, so I will skip a couple of slides here, but I just want to show that one program in which this Panama, this was done between SUMMA and the government of Panama. This is a national program of recovery of during pandemia after COVID-19. And this recovery program is totally based in evidence. So what we did was basically we targeted the attention of teachers and we channeled the effort of the Ministry of Education towards those pedagogical practices that were most promising in terms of evidence, but that were also adequate to the context of Panama and the culture of teachers. So with the Ministry of Education and through different focus groups, we chose these 4 practices, which are feedback, basically collaborative learning, among others. And basically, what we did was to focus on these practices through the creation of different guidelines to go from the what works to the how it can work. And in order to do that, also we did a special map of innovation for Panama, in which what we did was to look for innovations at the school level that were useful to implement this other 4 pedagogical practices. Finally, what we did is to create, so we have the programs, and then we created general and very specific also guidelines for teachers to learn about these practices. For example, here's collaborative learning with videos, and finally a MOOC in which through hybrid methods, we train teachers on how to provide and promote collaborative learning in the classroom. So just to finish, these are my last 2 slides, just to say that what we're trying to create in SUMMA and the examples that I've been providing is to really create this ecosystem of innovation. And the last example of this, I think, is a very good example of what we're doing, has to do with the KICS initiative. The KICS initiative is the Knowledge Innovation Exchange initiative that is being promoted by the Global Partnership for Education. It's an initiative that what it looks for is to promote, well, the very contextualized generation of knowledge and the mobilization of that knowledge to improve policymaking. For that purpose, 4 hubs have been created, 2 in Africa, 1 in Asia, and 1 in Latin America. The one in Latin America is led by SUMMA. And what we do in this hub is that we bring together the ministries of education, the teacher unions, academics, and people from civil society from 8 different countries in Central America and the Caribbean. We define priorities in terms of policies and therefore in terms of the need for evidence. We create and synthesize evidence on those priorities. And finally, we mobilize that evidence. Just to put one example, and this is the last example I put, is the fact that one of the main priorities for these countries was the fact that teacher training, initial teacher training, was very weak. For that purpose, of course, we synthesized and generated a lot of information. And finally, we mobilized it through the reform of the curriculum of the Faculty of Education at the University of West Indies, which is the main university in the Caribbean. Through this change, we're targeting 22% of the stock of teachers in the next 10 years. And therefore, we're, again, using evidence to inform this reform, moving from just, again, creating the synthesis or putting a platform into real-world reforms, in this case, a curriculum reform in the most important university in the Caribbean. will stop here, of course, because of time, and I apologize because I see now a bit longer. Thank you very much, and open to questions, of course.
There's a question. There's a comment and question in the chat.
Okay, so David, yeah,
From
he's
David, yeah.
saying his connection's unstable, so I'll go ahead and read for him. So he's saying there's always change that comes from inside, much like a force that breaks the inertia of the institution. And that's when, as a teacher myself, I dare to promote a different methodology approach inside the classroom. Of course, it could lead to a disaster, but in the end, things end up changing always, especially since education is a science. And in the light of new evidence, if the people who run the school are educators too, they will follow it, as the purpose is to always improve the process of learning, teaching at the same time. At the same time, certainly there are, oh, it just changed my view. Apologies. At the same time, certainly there are other people who follow the fallacy of it's always been this way, so it's perfect, nothing should change. And the schools continue to function in the 19th century style of lecturing, memorizing, repeating, without opportunities for students to develop their creative and critical thought changes. Opportunities for students to develop their creative and critical thought changes are really hard to achieve. When students have acquired the attitude to dare being creative and critical, then the system has already changed and they are ready to understand they are responsible by their own knowledge acquisition. So teachers are the key for changing in educational institutions, if they dare to. So the question is, how much influence do you think teachers have to promote educational changes?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think teachers are key, both to improve or to block change. Let me put different examples in the negative and positive direction. In the case of Uruguay, and to put real case studies that we have worked in SUMMA, in the case of, for example, of Uruguay, Uruguay has a lot of attrition in secondary education, one of the largest and highest in Latin America. And of course, it's very linked to repetition, to the fact that you have a lot of repetition rates in secondary education. And we have done a lot of focus groups with teachers in Uruguay. And when you ask teachers in Uruguay and you show them evidence on the repetition being a very, very bad practice, what they say is that for them, in terms of institutional, again, this would be a social norm. And it's both a formal norm because, of course, it's part of a legislation, but also it's how teachers act upon that. And you show them that repetition is a very bad policy for education because, of course, it increases the cost. It creates a lot of identity issues for the student, and that finally that student will leave the system. They will say that for them it's very difficult to decrease the amount of students they repeat each year, because part of the status as a teacher comes from how many students you fail by the end of the year. Okay, so there's a peer-to-peer pressure between teachers in saying, well, if you're not failing students, that means basically you're a very easy teacher. You're not doing your job. So you're supposed to be a much harsh teacher. So just a very quick example on how social norms can affect the practices that teachers have, and the importance that, in this case, negatively, how teachers can have a very negative effect on the trajectory of students. On the other hand, of course, teachers have a very important role, both at the macro level, in unions and through teacher experts, in informing policymakers on what are the best practices actually to improve education and make it more equitable. Therefore, at the macro level, in changing institutions in the sense of these different laws and regulations, of course, they play a key role, but also within the current legislation. Of course, what teachers do in the classroom seems to be, of course, and it shows that the most important factor for improving education. The question is that, do teachers really know how to do that? And sometimes I've experienced, and I'm going to say, for example, in Panama, and with this I finish with another example, a teacher in which during the pandemic, he would sit two students one next to another in a kind of learning recovery class. And when I asked him what were they doing, he said, "Oh, they're doing collaborative learning." And I said, "Okay, what are you doing with them for them to collaborate?" And she said, actually, "No, they're just sitting together, so they're collaborating." So my point is, sometimes teachers think that they know how to do collaborative learning, and sometimes they really don't. And it's not the fault of their own in many of the cases. It's because they haven't been trained for that with those skills or for those contexts. And in this sense, for example, what data shows us is that most of teachers, for example, have not been trained for the diversity that today exists, for example, in Latin American classrooms. So the teacher is key, and the teacher has a tacit knowledge that is key, of course, and that should be taken into account, which is extremely valuable for policymakers. And therefore, yeah, I think, I mean, definitely it's the key actor in the educational system.
Javier, it's really nice to see the 4 waves and how that's informing the debate about what to do. And I love the way you're looking at local evidence in schools. Yeah, be interesting to see how to apply that in other areas of the Campbell collaboration.
To be honest, I wanted to center more on the fact that I get the feeling that we're usually in many of the fora, we're centering on the fact that scaling is kind of a linear and automatic process. That's why I gave so much time to the first part of the session, but I didn't have so much time to share. But we're doing a lot of things, a lot of different projects in the region, in which what we're doing is taking that evidence and really putting it up there to be used in education reforms at a very high kind of structural level, which goes beyond the typical discussion on piloting a program and trying to scaling up a program. Because again, that I think it's a limited perspective. It's a valid one and an important one, of course, but it's complementary to one which sees the importance of system transformation, which goes beyond just scaling one program at a time. Because governments are not just providers of multiple programs, they're providers of policies. And what we believe in SUMMA is that we have to change our policies in the structural way of looking at it.
So David's asking if you think national curriculum of Chile with skills and attitudes for the 21st century is a good approach for change.
Oh, that's a quite long discussion. That will take a long time to really go into the discussion. But what I would like to say is that we have long gone through a long process of curriculum change, which of course is very important. It has been taking up the competencies approach is based on educational goals, and what I would like to, and again, I know I have probably just one last minute to say something, is that one thing is the approach, and going back to the teachers, David, on your question, I think the most important issue on curriculum, of course, is curriculum, how that is articulated with textbooks and with assessment. And in Chile, I would like to broaden your question, is that we can discuss the curriculum itself, but the problem sometimes is not very coherent with a very high stake accountability system that tends to reward especially improvement in math and language among mainly. So 21st century skills sometimes tend to get out of that equation in a very high stake accountability system such as the Chilean one. We're making efforts to improve that, but the problem is that sometimes you can have it even in the curriculum, but the problem is the implementation. And again, here is one issue, is the issue of how do we articulate the different subsystems of assessment and also of support of teachers, but also is how we implement that in the classroom itself. And what we see in general, and not only in Chile, maybe I want to broaden the question beyond Chile, is the fact that in most of our countries, what we see is that one thing is the prescribed, of course, curriculum, and the other one is what it actually gets implemented in the classroom. And the main problem of what gets implemented, one has to do with the incentives that a high-stake accountability system may create. That's one problem. But another problem, much more frequent, is the fact that teachers don't have the competencies to actually implement the curriculum in the classroom. So teacher training is key, and most important is pedagogical support of teachers in the classroom. What we see in the region, and we're working in many countries in this issue, which I'm going to say now, has to do with how to improve the pedagogical support that the state provides to teachers in the classroom. In most of this, of our countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, teachers are not being supported continuously by the government. They get some kind of supervision, which in many cases is called, or pedagogical advice. Twice, if they're lucky, once, usually a year. So the lack of support, pedagogical support, and lack of training is the main limitation that hinders the implementation of any curriculum based on 21st century skills.
Thanks, Javier.
It's the same comment I was just making right now, is the fact that on the one hand, teachers don't have the competencies because they haven't been trained to promote collaborative learning in the classroom. And I say this having worked for now the last 3 years with several schools in the north of Chile, in a very vulnerable communities, in which of course teachers put the best of the effort, but they themselves will admit the fact that they haven't been trained to promote effective collaborative learning in the classroom. So that's one problem of that objective. It's not the objective itself, it's how we implement it in the classroom. And the second is the fact that the capacity of the state to support that teacher beyond initial training, what we call, of course, continuous training, teacher training and support, is not actually being done effectively or not enough as one would expect. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Javier. So I think we will wrap up now.
Thank you to Campbell Collaboration Foundation for this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you.